September 3, 1864, 1 p.m., Hellenborg, Stockholm. Alfred Nobel stood 50 yards from the wooden shed, his stopwatch marking the seconds before detonation. Inside the shed sat 5 pounds of nitroglycerin mixed with silica powder, his latest attempt to stabilize the most powerful explosive ever discovered and the chemical compound that had killed his younger brother Emil 3 weeks earlier. The Swedish authorities had banned further experiments within city limits after that explosion. The neighbors had petitioned to have Nobel arrested. His father had suffered a stroke from the grief. None of this stopped Alfred from continuing experiments that everyone, scientists, government officials, his own mother, had begged him to abandon. What those watching from a safe distance couldn't know, what Nobel himself was only beginning to understand, was that the substance in that shed would kill more human beings than any other invention in history. Not immediately, not through the explosion about to occur, but through the cascading consequences of creating an explosive powerful enough to level mountains, portable enough for soldiers to carry, stable enough for industrial production, and cheap enough for governments to purchase by the ton. The death ray that Tesla promised never worked. The exotic physics that consumed brilliant minds proved impractical. But nitroglycerin stabilized into dynamite would kill tens of millions across 150 years of warfare and transform Alfred Nobel from a respected chemist into the man whose name became synonymous with industrial-scale death. This is the story of how Alfred Nobel's search for chemical stability created the explosives revolution that made modern warfare possible, not through malice or military ambition, but through solving a practical problem that nobody had asked him to solve. The story of how one chemist's obsession with taming an unstable liquid created the weapons that would devastate cities, sink navies, and turn artillery into the greatest killer in human history. And the story of how guilt over that legacy drove Nobel to create the prizes that would honor peace while his explosives continued destroying it. Nitroglycerin was discovered in 1847 by Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero, who immediately recognized he had created something both revolutionary and horrifying. The pale yellow oil was formed by mixing glycerin with nitric and sulfuric acids, a relatively simple process that produced a liquid explosive far more powerful than gunpowder. A single drop placed on an anvil and struck with a hammer would detonate with a sharp crack that shattered glass across the laboratory. Larger amounts produced devastating explosions, but nitroglycerin was lethally unstable. Shock, friction, heat, and even vibration could trigger detonation without warning. Sobrero tested his discovery, documented its properties, and publicly recommended that nobody attempt to develop it for practical use. The substance was simply too dangerous to control. Most chemists agreed. Nitroglycerin remained a laboratory curiosity throughout the 1950s, fascinating in theory, impractical in reality, far too unstable for any commercial or military application. Then, Emanuel Nobel, a Swedish engineer and inventor who had made and lost several fortunes through various industrial ventures, encountered the substance while working on military contracts in Russia. Emanuel understood immediately that nitroglycerin's power could revolutionize mining, tunneling, and construction if anyone could find a way to stabilize it for transport and use. He began experimenting with various additives and mixing methods, trying to create a form of nitroglycerin that wouldn't explode spontaneously. His son Alfred, born in 1833 in Stockholm, grew up surrounded by his father's experiments. Alfred was frail, frequently ill, intellectually brilliant, and fascinated by chemistry. Where other children played with toys, Alfred conducted experiments. Where teenagers pursued social activities, Alfred read chemistry texts and corresponded with leading scientists. By age 17, he had traveled across Europe studying with prominent chemists, learning languages, and absorbing everything known about explosives, chemistry, and industrial processes. When he returned to Sweden in 1863, his father was conducting nitroglycerin experiments in a small factory outside Stockholm. Alfred joined the work, bringing systematic scientific methodology to what had been trial and error experimentation. The explosion that killed Emil Nobel on September 3, 1864, occurred during routine nitroglycerin production. 5 people died instantly when the factory exploded without warning, destroying the building and shaking Stockholm so violently that residents miles away thought an earthquake had struck. Emil was 21 years old. The other victims were workers whose names history didn't record. Alfred, who had been away during the explosion, returned to find his factory destroyed, his brother dead, his father incapacitated by a stroke, and local authorities threatening criminal charges if experiments continued. Most people would have stopped. Alfred accelerated his work, not from recklessness, but from a combination of scientific curiosity, financial desperation, and perhaps guilt that demanded he give meaning to his brother's death. If nitroglycerin was going to kill people, and the explosion had proven it would, then Nobel was determined that those deaths would at least contribute to making the substance useful. He relocated experiments on a barge on Lake Mälaren, where explosions couldn't harm anyone except himself. He worked alone, conducting hundreds of experiments testing different stabilizers, absorbents, and mixing techniques. The breakthrough came not through sophisticated chemistry, but through systematic experimentation with absorbent materials. Nobel tested everything: sawdust, coal dust, paper pulp, brick powder, and cement. Each material absorbed nitroglycerin, creating a paste that could be shaped and handled. But most were either too absorbent, reducing explosive power significantly, or insufficiently stabilizing. Then Nobel tried kieselguhr, a fine silica powder composed of fossilized algae. The results were remarkable. Kieselguhr absorbed 3 times its weight in nitroglycerin, creating a dough-like substance that retained approximately 75% of pure nitroglycerin's explosive power, while being dramatically safer to handle. The paste could be dropped, struck, or subjected to friction without detonating. It required a blasting cap, a small primary explosive charge to trigger detonation. Nobel called his invention dynamite, from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power. He patented the formulation in 1867 and began manufacturing immediately. The commercial success was instant and overwhelming. Mining companies, railroad builders, and construction firms had been limited by gunpowder's relatively weak explosive force. Dynamite was 8 times more powerful than gunpowder, could be shaped to fit specific applications, and was transportable without requiring the extreme caution that nitroglycerin demanded. Within 5 years, Nobel had established factories across Europe and America. Within a decade, dynamite was the standard explosive for all major industrial projects. Within 20 years, Alfred Nobel was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. But dynamite's success in industry immediately attracted military interest. Explosive shells filled with gunpowder had limited destructive power. The relatively weak explosion simply scattered shrapnel over a small area. Shells filled with dynamite were devastating, creating massive blast waves that destroyed fortifications and killed through concussion as much as fragmentation. Naval mines filled with dynamite could sink the largest warships. Torpedoes became practical weapons. Artillery transformed from a supporting arm to the dominant killer on battlefields. Nobel had intended dynamite for industrial use, but he couldn't control its application. Governments purchased dynamite by the ton for military stockpiles. Nobel's patents made him wealthy. His invention made modern warfare exponentially more lethal. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 was the first major conflict where dynamite was available, though its military use remained limited. Nobel's patents restricted production, and military procurement systems moved slowly. But military theorists observing the war recognized that high explosive shells represented revolutionary capability. Prussian artillery, while still using gunpowder charges, achieved devastating effectiveness through improved tactics and superior organization. Imagine, theorists argued, that the same artillery using shells 10 times more powerful. The implications were obvious and terrifying. Nobel continued refining explosives throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Dynamite, while far more stable than pure nitroglycerin, still presented problems. In hot climates, nitroglycerin could sweat out of the kieselguhr, creating dangerous liquid pools. In cold weather, dynamite froze solid, becoming difficult to use and even more unstable. Nobel developed improved formulations. Gelignite, which mixed nitroglycerin with nitrocellulose to create a gelatinous explosive more stable than dynamite, and blasting gelatin, which was almost entirely composed of explosives with minimal inert absorbent material. Each improvement increased power, improved stability, and made Nobel wealthier while simultaneously making warfare more destructive. The most consequential development came in 1887 when Nobel invented ballistite, a smokeless powder that revolutionized firearms and artillery. Gunpowder produced enormous clouds of white smoke when burned, obscuring battlefields and revealing gun positions. Smokeless powder, composed of nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin mixed with stabilizers, burned almost without smoke, produced higher velocities, and generated less fouling in gun barrels. Every major military force immediately recognized that smokeless powder made existing tactics obsolete. Artillery could fire without revealing positions, infantry could see targets through their own rifle smoke. Automatic weapons became practical because the reduced fouling allowed sustained fire without jamming. But ballistite also ignited one of history's great patent disputes. French chemist Paul Vier had developed smokeless powder independently, patenting poudre bay in 1884. Nobel's ballistite was chemically similar, leading to accusations of patent infringement and industrial espionage. The dispute became international, involving governments, courts, and scientific societies. Ultimately, Nobel lost major legal battles, was denied military contracts in several countries, and developed a bitter resentment toward France that would later influence how he structured his famous prizes. The smokeless powder wars demonstrated that explosive innovations were too militarily significant to be controlled by individuals, regardless of patents or intentions. By 1890, Nobel owned factories across Europe producing dynamite, gelignite, ballistite, and blasting powder. He held 355 patents covering explosives, synthetic materials, and industrial processes. He was one of the wealthiest individuals in Europe, and he was increasingly isolated, depressed, and conflicted about his legacy. His explosives were being used in mining, construction, and industrial development exactly as he had intended. They were also being stockpiled by every military force in preparation for wars that would kill millions. Nobel understood the dual-use problem but couldn't solve it. He couldn't limit dynamite to peaceful use without abandoning the industry he had created. He couldn't prevent military applications without abandoning his patents and fortune. He was trapped by his own success. Nobel's personal life was characterized by isolation and failed relationships. He never married, though he maintained a long correspondence with Bertha von Suttner, an Austrian pacifist who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize that he established. Von Suttner repeatedly challenged Nobel about his explosives' military applications, arguing that his inventions made warfare more terrible and therefore more likely. Nobel's responses revealed a complex rationalization. He believed that increasingly destructive weapons would make war so horrifying that nations would pursue peace rather than risk mutual annihilation. This logic, that deterrence through overwhelming destructive capability would prevent war, would be echoed throughout the 20th century in nuclear deterrence theory. It was equally wrong in both contexts. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 demonstrated what modern high explosives meant for warfare. Artillery firing high-explosive shells killed more soldiers than all other causes combined. Defensive fortifications that would have resisted gunpowder shells were obliterated by high-explosive bombardment. Naval battles were decided by long-range shell fire using improved propellants that Nobel's research had enabled. Combat became industrialized, killing on a scale that would have seemed impossible 30 years earlier. Nobel died in 1896, spared from witnessing these wars, but their character was inevitable given the weapons he had created. Nobel's death in December 1896 revealed the will that established the Nobel Prizes, awards honoring achievements in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. The inclusion of a peace prize was unexpected, given Nobel's career supplying militaries with explosives. Interpretations of his motivation vary. Some historians argue that Nobel experienced genuine remorse and wanted to atone for creating weapons of mass destruction. Others suggest the Peace Prize was pragmatic reputation management by a man who recognized his name would forever be associated with industrial killing. Nobel's own writings are ambiguous, suggesting both motivations coexisted. The establishment of Nobel Prizes from dynamite profits created an irony that persists today. The awards celebrating human achievement and promoting peace are funded by explosives that killed tens of millions. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to individuals working to prevent wars enabled by weapons that the Nobel Prize created. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry has recognized research into explosives and propellants descended from Nobel's work. The fortune funding the prizes continues to grow through investments, including companies involved in defense manufacturing. Nobel wanted his legacy to emphasize peace and scientific achievement. History remembers him primarily as the man who made modern warfare explosively deadly. World War I validated every nightmare about high explosives. Artillery became the dominant killer, responsible for approximately 60% of combat casualties. Explosive shells devastated trenches, destroyed fortifications, and created moonscapes of shell craters across Europe. The industrial scale of explosive consumption was unprecedented. Major artillery barrages could consume 1 million shells in days. The Battle of Verdun alone involved the expenditure of approximately 40 million shells. Every shell was made possible by the explosive revolution that Nobel initiated. Soldiers weren't killed by individual marksmanship or tactical brilliance. They were killed industrially by explosives delivered by artillery, mines, grenades, and bombs. The chemical weapons introduced during World War I, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, captured public horror and became symbols of war's inhumanity. But high-explosive artillery killed far more people than chemical weapons. The difference was that chemical weapons seemed novel and horrifying, while explosive shells seemed normal and acceptable. Society had normalized industrial killing through explosives within a single generation. Nobel's search for stable explosives had succeeded so thoroughly that mass death through explosive bombardment became unremarkable background noise in discussions of warfare. World War II demonstrated that explosive technology continued to advance. TNT, trinitrotoluene, largely replaced dynamite for military applications, more stable, more powerful, easier to manufacture. Shaped charges using explosive principles that Nobel had helped establish could penetrate the thickest armor. Strategic bombing dropped millions of tons of explosives on cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented a quantum leap in explosive power, but followed a conceptual lineage from Nobel's work, creating more powerful explosives through chemical manipulation.
The total explosive consumption in World War II exceeded 5 million tons, enough high explosive to fill a freight train stretching from New York to Los Angeles. Every ton traced conceptual descent from Nobel's work on stabilizing nitroglycerin. Every death from explosive blast, fragmentation, or concussion was enabled by the revolutionary Nobel Prize. The numbers became so large they lost meaning. Cities destroyed, millions killed. Industrial-scale death was delivered through explosives that were direct descendants of dynamite's chemistry. Post-war weapons development continued the explosive arms race. Nuclear weapons dominated strategic thinking, but conventional high explosives remained the actual killers in conflicts from Korea through Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of smaller wars. Explosive technology advanced. Plastic explosives like C4 provided power and stability beyond anything Nobel achieved. Fuel-air explosives created massive blast effects. Shaped charges defeated advanced armor. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Chemical explosives release energy rapidly to create a destructive blast and fragmentation. Nobel's legacy continued killing for decades after his death. Modern terrorism demonstrates another dark consequence of Nobel's success. The same properties that made dynamite useful for mining, portability, power, relative stability, make modern explosives effective terrorist weapons. Improvised explosive devices killed thousands of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Terrorist bombings from Oklahoma City to numerous suicide attacks employ explosive principles that Nobel helped establish. The democratization of explosive technology means that individuals and small groups can access destructive capabilities that would have required armies in earlier eras. Nobel wanted his explosives to serve progress and development. They also enabled asymmetrical warfare and terror. The cumulative death toll from explosive weapons since 1867 is impossible to calculate precisely, but exceeds 50 million people killed directly by artillery shells, bombs, grenades, mines, and explosive weapons descended from Nobel's inventions. This excludes indirect deaths from destroyed infrastructure, contamination, and long-term environmental damage. The number is conservative. Actual deaths attributable to the explosive revolution likely exceed 100 million when all consequences are accounted for. One chemist's solution to industrial explosives created the dominant killing technology of modern warfare. The moral complexity of Nobel's legacy resists simple judgment. He didn't intend military applications. His initial goal was solving practical industrial problems. He couldn't control how his inventions were used once patents expired and technology spread. He arguably experienced genuine remorse, establishing the Nobel Prizes as partial atonement. But he also profited enormously from military sales, held patents specifically designed to capture military markets, and continued developing explosives with obvious military applications long after their destructive potential became clear. Nobel was neither a monster nor an innocent victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was a brilliant chemist who solved technical problems without adequately considering consequences, became wealthy from applications he claimed to oppose, and tried to posthumously rehabilitate his legacy through philanthropy funded by the profits from industrial killing. The Nobel Prizes themselves embody this moral complexity. The awards honor genuine achievement and have recognized scientists, writers, and peace advocates whose work improved humanity. The Peace Prize specifically has highlighted individuals fighting against warfare and its consequences, but the fortune funding these awards came from explosives that killed millions. Winners of Nobel Prizes have conducted their award-winning research using funding from governments that purchased Nobel's explosives for military stockpiles. The Peace Prize has been awarded while wars funded by Nobel Prize investments continued killing. The contradiction isn't resolvable. It's the permanent tension between technological capability and human wisdom, between power and responsibility, between achievement and consequence. At the Nobel Museum in Stockholm sits a collection of Nobel's laboratory notebooks, letters, and equipment. The displays emphasize his industrial achievements, his role in developing Sweden's chemical industry, and the prizes that bear his name. The military applications of his inventions receive brief mention, carefully framed as an unfortunate misuse of technology intended for peaceful purposes. The museum's narrative is Nobel's preferred legacy, the benefactor funding prizes that honor achievement and peace. History's narrative is more complicated. Nobel created the explosives that made modern warfare industrially lethal, profited enormously from military sales, and established peace prizes partially from guilt over that legacy. The death ray that Tesla promised never materialized. The exotic weapons that seemed revolutionary proved impractical. But the stable explosive that Nobel created by mixing nitroglycerin with kieselguhr changed warfare permanently and killed tens of millions across 150 years, not through sophisticated science or revolutionary physics, but through solving a practical problem, making the most powerful explosive available stable enough for transport and use. The solution was elegant. The consequences were catastrophic. The legacy is permanent. Alfred Nobel died believing his explosives would make war so terrible that nations would pursue peace. He was wrong. His explosives made war more terrible, and nations adapted to fighting with industrial-scale killing that would have seemed impossible before dynamite existed. The deterrence theory failed because humans proved more adaptable to horror than Nobel anticipated. Society normalized mass death through explosive bombardment within a generation. What should have been unthinkable became standard military practice. What should have promoted peace enabled the bloodiest century in human history. The irony that haunts Nobel's legacy is that he succeeded completely at his technical goal, creating stable, powerful, commercially viable explosives, while failing utterly at his humanitarian hope that destructive capability would promote peace. Dynamite worked perfectly. Deterrence through destructive potential failed. The technical achievement was brilliant. The strategic assumption was catastrophically wrong. And millions died because one chemist was better at chemistry than at understanding human nature. September 3, 1864. The shed explodes. 5 pounds of stabilized nitroglycerin detonates successfully, confirming that Nobel's experiment worked. The explosion damages nothing and kills nobody, a controlled success rather than the chaos that killed Emil. Nobel records the results, adjusts formulations, and continues experiments that will lead to dynamite, the Industrial Revolution, and military transformation. The sound of that explosion echoed through Verdun, the Somme, Dresden, Hiroshima, and 10,000 other places where explosive weapons killed millions. Nobel never imagined the cascade of consequences flowing from that successful test. He was solving a chemistry problem. He created the killing technology that defined modern warfare. The experiment worked. Humanity is still measuring the cost.